There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from never quite belonging anywhere. You are at a family gathering, and the older relatives talk about a world that no longer exists. You nod. You understand their references, the music, the struggle, the values, but something in you knows you are not quite them. Then you turn to the younger people in the room, and they are speaking an entirely different language, digital, fast, confident in a way that feels almost foreign to you. And you smile, and you participate. But somewhere underneath all of that, a quiet thought surfaces. Where exactly do I fit? If you were born between 1977 and 1985, that feeling is not random. It is not a personal flaw or a sign of some unresolved identity crisis. It is the defining psychological experience of your generation. A generation that has been called many things, but most accurately called Xennials. And the weight of being in between is something no other generation has ever carried in quite the same way. This is not a story about hardship for its own sake. It is a story about something far more complex, the psychology of living in the space between two worlds and what that does to a person over the course of an entire lifetime. Let us go back to the beginning. You grew up in a world that was analog in the most complete sense of the word. Saturday mornings meant cartoons on a single television set in the living room. Boredom was not something to be solved with a device. It was something you sat with, wandered through, and eventually turned into imagination. You played outside until the streetlights came on. You memorized phone numbers because there was no other option. You wrote letters. You waited. You learned without anyone ever teaching you that some things simply take time, and that time in its slower form had a texture to it that was worth paying attention to. Your childhood was largely unsupervised in the way that childhood used to be, not out of neglect, but out of a cultural understanding that children needed space to become themselves without constant management. You fell off your bike and got back on. You had disagreements with friends that lasted a week and resolved themselves without any adult intervention. You developed a particular kind of self-sufficiency that came not from being taught resilience, but simply from living in circumstances that required it. And then, somewhere in your teenage years or early adulthood, everything changed. Not slowly, not gradually, almost overnight. The internet arrived, and with it a new way of existing in the world that was so fundamentally different from everything you had known that your brain had to perform a kind of double translation, converting the analog instincts of your childhood into the digital demands of a world that was accelerating faster than anyone could fully process. You were not a digital native. You did not grow up with a smartphone in your hand or a social media profile as an extension of your identity, but you were young enough and adaptable enough to learn, to adjust, to become fluent in a language that was not your mother tongue, and to do it well enough that most people around you would never know the translation was happening at all. This is the first and most defining tension of the Xennial experience. You are bilingual in a way that no generation before or after you has been. You speak both analog and digital. You understand both worlds from the inside. And that sounds on the surface like an advantage. In many ways it is. But it also means you are never fully native to either world. There is always a part of you that remembers something the digital world does not have room for, and there is always a pressure, subtle but persistent, to perform a fluency you sometimes have to work harder for than those who came after you. The psychologists who study generational identity have a concept called a cohort effect, the idea that the specific historical and cultural circumstances you grow up in shape not just your memories, but the actual architecture of how you think, feel, and relate to the world. And for Xennials, the cohort effect is uniquely layered, because you did not experience one defining era, you experienced two, and the seam between them runs directly through the middle of who you are. Think about what that means psychologically. Your internal model, the model you developed in childhood for how the world works, what to expect from it, and how to navigate it, was built in an analog environment. An environment of patience, of physical presence, of delayed gratification, of face-to-face connection as the primary mode of human relationship. That template is real. It is deep. It was formed during the most formative years of neurological development, and it does not simply disappear because the world around it changed. But the world you operate in as an adult is almost entirely digital. Fast, immediate, constantly stimulating, built around metrics and visibility and the performance of a self that can be curated and optimized. And so every single day, without ever consciously choosing to, you are running two operating systems simultaneously, the one you were born into and the one you learned to survive in. That is exhausting, in a way that is very difficult to articulate to people who only know one system. And there is something else, something that goes deeper than the digital-analog divide, something that touches the very core of how Xennials understand themselves and their place in the world. But before we get there, consider for a moment what it actually cost to make that transition. Because it was not free. It never is. When you moved from an analog world into a digital one, you did not simply acquire new skills. You also lost something, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone acknowledging that a loss had occurred. You lost the pace, the particular rhythm of a life that was not constantly interrupted, not perpetually available, not measured in engagement metrics and notification counts. You lost the version of yourself that existed before every thought could be broadcast, before every moment required a decision about whether to document it, before the concept of being always on had any meaning at all. And because the transition happened during a period when the cultural conversation was entirely focused on the excitement of what was being gained, connection, speed, information, possibility, there was no space to grieve what was quietly disappearing. So you adapted. You always do. But adaptation has a cost that rarely appears on the surface. It appears later, in the moments of stillness, in the inexplicable longing for something you cannot quite name, in the sense that the world is moving at a speed that your nervous system was never fully designed for. This is not nostalgia. It is something more specific than that. It is the experience of having two different versions of normal and never being entirely sure which one is actually yours. You are a generation that was never given a clear cultural identity. The boomers have their revolution, their music, their mythology of the 1960s. Generation X has its irony, its grunge, its reputation for cynicism turned into a kind of art form. Millennials have their avocado toast and their student debt and their thoroughly documented anxiety about the future. Even Generation Z has its TikTok fluency and its climate activism and its radical openness about mental health. But Xennials? Xennials have always been described in relation to other generations. Too young to be Gen X, too old to be Millennials, the gap generation, the cusp generation, the ones who do not quite fit the box. And the absence of a clear generational narrative is not a trivial thing. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We need stories, not just personal ones, but collective ones. Stories that place us inside a larger human context, that tell us we are part of something, that our experiences are shared and recognized and worth naming. When those collective stories exist, they provide a kind of invisible scaffolding, something to lean against when the personal story gets complicated. Xennials were not given that scaffolding. They were given instead a shrug, a footnote, a qualifier. And so they did what they have always done. They built their own meaning, quietly, without making much of it, in the space between the stories that were being told about everyone else. And here is what that does to a person over time. When the cultural story being told about your generation is essentially that you do not have one, you begin, almost without noticing, to internalize that in-betweenness as something personal. not as a generational characteristic, but as a flaw, as evidence of something incomplete, as proof that you are somehow both too much and not enough, depending on the context and the company you are in. That is not a small thing. Identity, the story we tell ourselves about who we are and where we belong, is one of the foundational psychological structures of a human life. When that story is clear, when it connects you to something larger than yourself, it provides a quiet but powerful sense of groundedness. You know where you came from. You know what shaped you. You can locate yourself in the larger human story. But when that story is consistently described as an absence, as the space between two real things, the psychological effect is a particular kind of floating, a sense of being slightly untethered, present everywhere, fully rooted nowhere. This is the weight that Xennials carry, not loudly, not in a way that typically draws attention or sympathy, but consistently, across decades, in the small moments where the question of where exactly you belong rises to the surface and finds no clear answer waiting for it. And yet, and this is where the story begins to turn, there is something in that in-between space that is not a deficit, something that has been mistaken for incompleteness, but is actually a form of depth that very few people ever develop.
Because here is what living between two worlds actually builds in a person, whether they recognize it or not. It builds perspective, the kind that cannot be taught in a classroom or acquired through reading about it, the kind that only comes from having genuinely inhabited two completely different ways of being human, and carrying both of them inside you at the same time. Xennials understand something about patience that digital natives are still learning. They understand something about speed and connection that older generations are still catching up to. And they understand, perhaps more deeply than anyone, that neither world is complete on its own, that the analog and the digital are not opposites to be chosen between. They are dimensions of a fuller human experience that most people only ever access one half of. It builds empathy, because when you have spent your entire life translating between generations, between technologies, between cultural frameworks, you develop an almost instinctive ability to understand people who are different from you. You know what it is to stand at a threshold and look both ways. You know what it feels like to speak a language that is not your first. And that knowledge makes you, almost inevitably, more patient with the confusion of others, more capable of meeting people where they are, rather than where you need them to be. And it builds something rarer still, the capacity to hold complexity without needing to resolve it. Most people are deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity, with not knowing, with existing in the space between clear answers. But Xennials have been living in that space their entire lives. They have to. And what looked like rootlessness, what felt from the inside like never quite fitting, turns out to be its own kind of strength. The strength of someone who has learned to be at home in the in-between. This does not erase the weight. The weight is real. The loneliness of never quite belonging is real. The exhaustion of running two operating systems is real. The grief of a cultural identity that was never fully given to you is real. These things do not disappear simply because something meaningful can be found in them. But meaning is not the same as resolution, and healing for this generation does not look like finally finding the box you fit into. It looks like something quieter and more permanent than that. It looks like recognizing that the in-between was never a waiting room. It was never a temporary state on the way to somewhere more defined. It was always the place itself, your place, built not by accident, but by the specific and unrepeatable combination of everything you lived through and everything you carried forward. You are not a generation without a story. You are a generation whose story was too layered to fit in a single sentence, and that is not a limitation. That is the whole point. The weight of being in between is real, but so is what it made you. If this resonated with something you have been quietly carrying, you are not alone in this. More people recognize this feeling than you will ever know. If this channel is a place where you find something honest, something that makes the unnamed feel named, consider subscribing, not because the numbers matter, but because these conversations deserve to continue, and so do you.